Working capital is your debtors plus your stock plus your work in progress, if you have any, minus your creditors equals working capital. Working capital percentage is looking at your working capital divided by your annualized revenue to give you a percentage of how much working capital you need versus the revenue that you're producing. The reason this number is so important is this is going to be a benchmark to understand how much cash your business needs to grow. The lower your working capital percentage, the less cash your business will need to grow. What we aim for from a working capital perspective will be different in industry and by business. But as a broad benchmark, you ideally want your working capital percentage to be 20% and below, while still keeping a good relationship with your suppliers. To use an example like a supermarket that's very large in nature, they'll have no debtors, they'll have relatively small stock in comparison to their day's creditors. That means that they'll end up with a negative working capital percentage, but despite all their commercials, they probably don't have a great relationship with their suppliers. For us in the privately owned business sphere, it's important to have good relationships with our suppliers. Hence, having that working capital percentage, we ideally want it 20% and below. If we've got our working capital percentage at 25% and above, that is when things become more challenging from a funding our growth perspective. Out of interest, and you may have seen other videos on this, the metric around working capital versus gross profit is going to be a key factor in our growth. The bigger the gap between the gross profit percentage and the working capital percentage, the easier it is for our business to grow, where we want gross profit to be the higher of those two numbers. How do we influence working capital and working capital percentage? Let's look at all the different factors. Firstly, debtors, the people who we've sold to on credit that owe us money. The quicker that we can get them to pay us or even get deposits from people, that reduces our debtor obligations. Moving to our stock and our work in progress, how do we manage our stock so that we can use the Goldilocks principle of having just the right amount of stock to meet demand, but not too much of an impost on our cash, and also balancing our creditors. We want to keep our creditors managed so that if someone gives us terms, we utilize those terms. There's a whole lot of theory that goes into looking after your suppliers, which I completely agree with, but for this video, we'll assume we pay them on their terms. Then to influence the percentage, further to those factors we just talked about, is how do I increase my revenue? How can I increase my revenue at a disproportionate rate to what I increase my working capital? If I can increase my revenue by 20%, but only increase my working capital by 10%, that is a winning equation for this formula and for my business.